evening, everyone. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones, and remember, no flash photography is allowed during tonight's event. After the lecture, we will have a book signing upstairs in the lobby. Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Margie Wachs Weingarten, and together with my sisters, Buffy and Esther, our family endowed a lecture series in honor of our father, Ellis, and his love of history. The Free Library is dedicated to advancing literacy, guiding learning, and inspiring curiosity. Many of its most beloved programs and services are made possible only with the help of private support. Please consider making a gift online at freelibrary.org/support. It's now my pleasure to introduce T.J. Stiles, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the National Book Award for Nonfiction for his tome, The First Tycoon, The Epic Life of Cornelius Vanderbilt. He came to his writing career by first writing book jacket copy for other historians. Stiles has come a long way from those 300-word blurbs, filling hundreds of compelling pages about Jesse James in his first major work, Jesse James, Last Rebel of the Civil War, and then Cornelius Vanderbilt. A fellow 2011 of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and an elected member of the Society of American Historians, he also taught nonfiction creative writing at Columbia University. TJ's newest work, Custers Trials, A Life on the Frontier of a New America, aims to change the camera angle on historically caricatured Civil War hero and Little Bighorn martyr, General George Custer. The New York Times Book Review raves that he writes with both the panache of a fine journalist and the analytical care of a seasoned scholar. We are so excited to have him with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming T.J. Stiles to the Free Library.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was told the microphone was sensitive. I'll speak quietly. Thank you for coming to hear me speak, and thank you also for supporting the work of the library as well. Every author begins in a library reading and eventually ends in the library, although not every library takes your books. They're essential to what we do, and so it's a real pleasure to be here. My book is about someone for whom there's no shortage of books. And so I'll go straight to the natural question of why I wanted to write about George Armstrong Custer. The title of the book says a lot about what drew me to him, Custer's Trials. This is someone who went through metaphorical trials, went through trials by fire in the Civil War and in the West. He went through the court of public opinion and was tried and by many found wanting during his lifetime. This is someone who was tried in actual courts twice, court-martialed and convicted twice within 6 years. This is someone who was almost tried. The Army High Command talked about referring him to a civilian court for a trial for the charge of murder, which might have ended in his life being taken. And actually, without the Army acting, was tried in a civilian court for murder. This is someone whose death was investigated by the Army through a trial. So the trial represents not only Custer's life of constantly being challenged and tested and prosecuted and defended, but it also speaks to the way Americans during his lifetime and during our time argue about him. The first line of my book, leaving aside the preface, is that, Custer's guilt is not in doubt. The question is how harshly he should be punished for being Custer. Now that's a specific statement about his first court-martial immediately after he graduated from West Point. But in a sense, it's a question about Custer historically. He did things that are controversial today. He has been found guilty. The question is, Guilty of what? To what extent is he responsible? To what extent does that implicate the United States? So that's hovering out there. It's always hovering around Custer. For me, as a biographer, that tends to push me in the direction of either defending him or else prosecuting him, bashing him, as Custer's fans like to put it, or apologizing for him, as people who find him to have been a genocidal murderer, even maniac, would like to think. In fact, this story is much more complicated. And as I say, you know, the worst aspects of Custer, in some cases, have nothing to do with the things we associate with him, and in other ways, actually implicate the United States as a whole. And so Custer, in fact, I found was much more human and much more interesting, but also in some ways much more troubling than the common view of him is. Now, why Custer? This speaks to my view of my role as a biographer. I see biography as a genre in which scholarly values and literary values overlap. It's not simply presenting research. It's not simply a succession of facts, one damn thing after another, as people have described history. It is a combination of my effort to say something about the world, about the making of the United States, the making of American identity. And it's also my attempt to create that literary experience of an immersive book in which you feel and know what it's like to be a human being moving through the world. And with Custer, he was someone who more than almost anyone else in his period, allows me to do both. I began by thinking about his lifetime and about how the geographical movement of he and his wife across the United States during this period provides an amazing travelogue through the astonishing panorama of the United States in the mid to late 19th century. He was in the South, fighting in the middle of the Civil War, literally from the first battle of the Civil War to the last. This is a man who was dealing with slavery, emancipation, and its aftermath personally. This is someone who spent months, a total of 2 years of his life, in New York, in Manhattan, trying to engage with Wall Street and with the making of the new corporate economy at a time when in the South and as far north as Kentucky, the Ku Klux Klan is rampant, Reconstruction is playing out. In the far west, you have the industrial United States. Off to its west are nomadic peoples who are engaged in a hunting, gathering, and trading economy, living in a completely different culture and system of international relations, if you could put it that way. An astonishing panorama of the United States. And Custer, his life guides you through that time. And when I started to think about what Custer was doing, I realized that in every aspect of his life, not just as a soldier, but in many areas that have been neglected by most writers about him, he was engaged with the making of the modern world. The United States goes through something like an apocalypse during the Civil War and its aftermath. The original republic, the old antebellum United States, is completely destroyed. Out of it arises not simply a country with no slavery, but also a country that, through the political struggles of Reconstruction, creates civil rights laws and amendments, which are still the foundation of civil liberties as well as civil rights today. It comes out of the Civil War with a new sense of the role of the federal government. It comes out of the Civil War with a corporate economy, with the making of modern financial markets. We see the rise of modernism in intellectual culture. A whole wave of intellectuals come out of the Civil War disillusioned, realistic, even cynical. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Ambrose Bierce, Henry Adams and his brother Charles Francis Adams, Mark Twain. These are people who are affected by the Civil War very much like the way World War I affected the lost generation. It has shaken them to their core, and they come out with a very different sensibility than the earlier America. This is the age when we see national magazines, a really national literary culture begins to emerge in a new way. So in countless ways, the United States is undergoing these dramatic changes that make it a recognizable place. And Custer was engaging with all of those changes. He was trying to make a go of it on Wall Street, trying to make a fortune. He was writing for national magazines and trying to be a public intellectual. He was someone who was dealing personally, both as an army officer assigned to reconstruction duties, and also in his own household with the revolution in race relations. And the importance of race in his life reflects the importance of race in American history, especially at this time. And he's also dealing with the new challenges to the old restrictions placed on women. One of the things that the sources that are available for Custer allow me to do, which is an important part of my book, is to bring the women in his life to center stage, to make them full-fledged characters of their own, not only in their relationships with him, but their relationships with each other as well. And then there's simply Custer, the human being. E.M. Forster, in his book, it's actually a collection of lectures, Aspects of the Novel, defines the flat character versus the round character. The flat character is consistent. You introduce him once, he's the same. You never need to reintroduce him. The round character, the test of a round character is that he can surprise you convincingly. Custer was emphatically a round character. I felt when I was writing the book, even after doing all the research, that I didn't know what he would do next. This is a man who never saw a frying pan without immediately making a move for the fire. And that makes for wonderful storytelling. It's just simply a very vivid human story. And I'm not trying to pitch him, redeem him, make him into a nice man, even though I find his humanity on both sides, good and bad. But you know, nice guys often make for boring books. And I was trying to understand Custer, trying to make him a vivid, real person in himself and also as a way of seeing America. One way I put it is that I was trying to find out what made Custer tick, and tick, 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 and go boom, over and over and over again. Now, just to briefly talk about his life, and then we're going to be having questions, and I want to make sure I leave plenty of time because we'll illuminate some other issues, I'm sure, with answering questions. Custer was someone who came from a very poor background. His parents were really came from a border state culture. Southeastern Ohio with a Maryland-born father who was emphatically racist, who was a Jacksonian Democrat and really believed in those Jacksonian democratic virtues. Very poorly educated. His letters are full of spelling mistakes that go beyond the typical erratic spelling of the era. They were very poor during the Civil War. Custer was spending money lavishly, and he got a letter from his sister saying, "Mother needs $5 to fix a shed that's broken down. She doesn't want to ask you because she's afraid you won't have it." And this is immediately after Custer spent $30 on a portrait of himself. So that gives you an idea of that obscure, poor background. And he was always trying to escape it. And this goes to the core of what I see in Custer, something that, again, for all of the very good writing about him, you know, I am seeing things differently. My own view, my own interpretation. I found some things that for most people would be quite new, but it's really the way I put together, ask new questions, see things from a new angle that distinguishes my book. And I see Custer in his flamboyance, his sometimes outrageous attempts to get attention, his desire to be praised and loved. I see that as not just simply egotistical, blowhard glory hunting, but the flip side of it is this gnawing insecurity. And we see it whenever he was challenged. He got incredibly defensive, brittle, writing wordy, convoluted defenses of himself, trying to shout down the people criticizing him. And when later in his life he became controversial, it becomes a bigger and bigger part of his life. So this desire to be something great and to create an image of himself that he wanted to believe himself. He was always afraid not just that others would see him as the poor nobody, but that might actually be the truth about himself. That's my take on him. And that gnawing insecurity is kind of the ugly underside of the flamboyant, brash playing for the crowd that we see in him. So he was very lucky to get an appointment to West Point. He was appointed by a congressman who was from the Republican Party. He and his family were Democrats. He went to West Point, and again, you know, only 1% of men at the time went to college, and very few women. So simply going to college was a remarkable fact. And then he's going to the first college that is a school of professional education. Antebellum America, was a self-made, improvised country. Think of Lincoln. He was a self-taught lawyer, a corporate attorney before the Civil War, but self-taught. Well, the post-Civil War era is an era in which self-taught lawyers are not rising to the presidency. They are becoming increasingly professionalized. And so he's entering into the leading institution, the leading edge of the rise of the organizational society. And he does very badly. He's constantly trying to win the affection and the love of his fellow students, since he knows he won't succeed in school. Graduates in 1861, last in his class, first in demerits. Goes off to the Civil War, and the Civil War gives him purpose. Now we see another side of Custer, not simply the slightly cruel practical joke player, not simply the man who's desperate for the affection and love of his schoolmates, but someone who actually performed quite well when under fire, especially. And as a junior officer, I try to show the impact of this mass war and lay the seeds for understanding not only Custer, but how he differed from others of his generation in terms of the impact of the Civil War upon him. As a junior officer, he wrote letters describing some of the random brutality, the unpredictable death of the Civil War. And yet what happens to Custer is that he gets lifted out of that. Instead of being Ambrose Bierce, who's mired in infantry fighting in which heroism is punished with an instant death, he gets plucked out of obscurity by General McClellan, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, and put on his staff. And he becomes a protege, as the governor of Michigan put it, and not in a favorable way. He became McClellan's fair-haired boy. And like McClellan, he's very conservative, he's very political, but there's a difference. Custer would sneak off every chance he got and get assigned to raids and other operations and actually fight in person. And he was someone who wanted to win. He personally, culturally identified with the South, and yet he was someone who wanted to win the war at all costs. And that is ultimately what saved him when his patron fell. So here's a man who's working the antebellum, in an antebellum style, working the chains of patronage, trying to find a sponsor, and he lands on the staff of General Pleasanton, who becomes commander of the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. And then lucky for Custer, every bad event for America becomes luck for Custer. Lee invades the North, and Custer gets assigned to command of a brigade. After struggling to get command of a smaller unit, a regiment, he actually gets promoted at the age of 23 to brigadier general of volunteers. He shows up in this black velvet uniform, and generals' uniforms, they were double-breasted. Junior officers wore single-breasted uniforms. So he showed up in it immediately, which means he had it in his trunk. He's thinking, I might become a general in my 20s, and so I better be ready. He shows up immediately in this black velvet uniform with gold braid up the sleeves, with a blue sailor shirt tufted over his shoulders. And, his men, someone writes, not one of his men, but someone else who saw him, said he looked like a circus rider gone mad. Well, interestingly, there were other generals who dressed like Custer. They were all Southern generals. And, that speaks to the way this romantic sensibility he had is actually more associated with the South and also with an earlier America. It hasn't gone away yet. People appreciate it. As the mass killing of the war goes on, Custer's dashing appearance becomes very popular. It allows people to sort of cling to their earlier sensibilities, their romanticism about war, as the bloodshed of the war gradually wipes it out. And so the very fact that he was sort of out of place in industrialized warfare actually makes him more popular because he was good at it. And this is kind of the surprise for a lot of people, and to some extent for me as I worked on the book. The one area of his life in which he was consistently in control of himself, in which he was confident, was in warfare. Even that outlandish uniform sent a very well thought out signal to his men that he would be at their forefront. They would see him in his outrageous getup if he was shirking in the rear. So he couldn't afford to shirk in the rear if he's going to wear this attention-getting uniform. He's got to be in the forefront. And not only that, but his personal skill. He could actually fight very well. He may be one of the last generals in American history to actually kill someone in a sword fight. You know, the cavalry on cavalry fighting is this narrow little slice in which you could still be that romantic hero that all the boys who went to war in 1861 imagined themselves to be. And Custer is in that little slice of warfare in which he can play the romantic hero, in which his personal skill matters, and yet he also was a master of firepower, of deploying troops in a less dramatic way, of using his artillery adroitly. He really was a professional when it came to warfare, and he put his romantic affect to good practical use, which is important in understanding him. Well, you know, the other side of Custer comes out, I think, when we look at the women in his life. As he rises through the ranks and fights battle after battle, he does something which was actually a bit of self-indulgence. He goes to a camp for contrabands, who are people who've escaped from slavery, and he picks a young woman to be his cook. And he thought, you know, having a private cook, that's what a general should have. Well, this person becomes a very important part of my story, Eliza Brown. She was a self-emancipated slave who went to the Union lines. She takes this opportunity to work for Custer to finally build some personal security for herself. For the first time in her life, she doesn't have to, I mean, she does, I'm sure, at first, though she doesn't talk about it. Through her being in Custer's household, she finally is free from the threat of any white person doing anything they wanted to her. She finally builds some authority for herself by taking command of the general's mess, building her own patronage network by distributing some of the food to other escaped slaves, trading information very adroitly. Whenever a courier came to Custer's headquarters, she immediately gets out some biscuits and gets some information from him, which she trades. She is an amazing woman. Then Custer, their whole story that's a big part of the book, shows up with his new wife several months later. This new wife, another very interesting woman, very well educated. She had the equivalent of an undergraduate education, again, at a time when only 1% of men went to school. She has resented the restrictions placed on women, and yet she also accepts them. She's contradictory, like Custer. She shows up at the front. She goes to the front. It's winter. The fighting has died down, so she goes right to the front. And there in Custer's household is this literally a teenager, a young black woman. And Eliza Brown sees her, and she thinks, you know, basically, I don't know exactly what she thought, but she basically thinks, uh-oh, you know, like, I'm going to lose that authority I've put together, because the woman of the house, even if she doesn't do the work, is supposed to be in charge of the kitchen, in charge of the household. Libby Custer doesn't know how to deal with race relations. This is pre-Great Migration. She's not used to dealing with black people, whereas dealing with white people is the primary survival adaptation for Eliza Brown. Eliza Brown, very adroitly, without alienating Libby, keeps her out of the kitchen. She preserves this sphere of authority. And over the years, these two women develop a complicated relationship. They're allies. They're two women in a very male area. They're always in the army. And yet they also are subtly struggling for power. And it becomes more of a struggle as Libby kind of increasingly resents Eliza Brown's ability to keep her out. And within this three-way relationship, we see, you know, individual people struggling in their personal relationships with the larger questions of the day. Now, I try, as in every area in Custer's life, to be true to who these people are. And yet, it also echoes what's going on as the country deals with emancipation. As they go to Texas and occupy Texas. And Custer has to deal with a state that was never invaded by Union troops during the war, in which slavery has grown stronger, in which the local whites don't feel like they've been defeated. Eliza Brown is trying to teach the Custers about what slavery was like, takes them into the slave quarters. And yet Custer, who always wants to be favored by the most elite, is going hunting with the local planters. And so we see Custer's own sort of soul and his politics in flux as he's struggling with this. And then in 1866, he goes for the dark side, so to speak. He joins President Andrew Johnson as he campaigns against the 14th Amendment, which has been proposed, as he campaigns against the Republicans who are trying to establish rights for freed slaves. And again, this begins to alienate people who had seen Custer as a great hero. And the beginning, I think this is something people miss, the beginning of the great division over Custer, how he became controversial in his own time, is not over the West, though that adds to it later. It's over politics, it's over race, it's over equality, it's over the nature of citizenship itself. That's why people began to see Custer as controversial. And those questions are actually very relevant today, and it's very interesting to read about Custer's deep involvement in politics and the way people really bitterly divided over him during his lifetime. So Custer, of course, went west. I submitted an excerpt for the Smithsonian about his beginning of his post-Civil War career. You know, he explored ways in which he might lead a life outside of the Army, funded by a thoroughbred racehorse that he basically stole. He goes to New York. He loves New York. He loves the theater. He loves cosmopolitan culture. He's fascinated by Wall Street. The horse has a stroke, so he's unable to fund a new life in New York, so he goes west. But, you know, his constant demand for attention, that gnawing insecurity, is creating constant problems between himself and his wife. And yet, Custer, as difficult and complicated and unpleasant as he could be, you know, sometimes when I talk about how awful Custer could be, it was actually a struggle to say, okay, I've got to pay attention to the other side of him. For example, when he's out west, he has this amazing moment when he's alienated his wife. He's a gambling addict, among other things. And she's completely fed up with him over this. And so he went to New York in 1869, and he wrote a letter to her. They just had a huge knockdown, drag-out fight. And the letter is very interesting because it speaks to how he aggravated her, how he infuriated her, and it also reflects his emotional sensitivity. It's very interesting. It speaks to why they got over these moments. He writes to her, among other things, "I know that however badly I may have acted at times, there have been periods when you were satisfied with me. I can scarcely write. My eyes are blinded with tears, but I will try." He says, he wrote that he feared that any warmth that she showed to him concealed contempt. "I am not judging merely from the distressing words you spoke at the Southern Hotel in St. Louis. They were merely the culmination of thoughts which have long filled your mind against me. In your manner, you have been more or less mechanical." So he's not in his own world. He's paying attention to her. He feels that she's kind of drifting away from him, that she's putting on a show. This is a man who, as infuriating and it sometimes is really dark he could be, is alive to his marriage, who's having this passionate, intimate, and yet sometimes extremely combative and selfish relationship with his wife. These are real people. And so, you know, as alienating as Custer can be, I found a vivid, real person there. And when he goes west, you know, he's constantly telling a story about himself, trying to convince people that he's something extraordinary as he tries to be something extraordinary. So he goes west and he embraces the Western life. He dresses in this frontier getup, you know, not wearing a uniform, but wearing buckskins with fringes and moccasins. He wears his pistols on his hips the way Wild Bill Hickok does, who's one of his scouts. And yet his marriage is going through a crisis. And he's so desperate, I think he's probably cheating on his wife at this time, and he's worried she's going to find out. So he sent on his first campaign against the Native Americans, something I explore in depth, you know, their culture and the source of, on the High Plains, and the source of the conflict, environmental sources as well as political. But Custer is shying away from the battle. He's trying to get back to his wife, and he finally just abandons his men, takes an escort to go back to his wife. Two men get separated from the column, get ambushed and badly wounded. Custer hears about it and he just leaves them in the field. Someone else has to go rescue them. Gets back to his wife and, you know, is court-martialed, deservedly so. And, you know, this is a part of, again, that Custer as the figure on this chronological frontier. He's a man in the first large institution in the United States, the U.S. Army. The forerunner of the corporate world that's emerging. The first railroad corporations, in fact, all their engineers tended to be from West Point. You know, this is the first large institution. He's in a hierarchy, and he's aggravating everybody up and down the chain of command, treating his men badly when he's insecure, especially, aggravating his superiors, building this terrible reputation. And, you know, I follow the way people talked about him within official communications. the way he builds this terrible reputation for himself. And so he's court-martialed, he's let off pretty lightly, given suspended for a year, and then he rescues himself. And how does he do it? By his ability to fight. And this is a pattern that we see through his lifetime when, people become completely aggravated with him. They're ready to just cashier him and toss him out of the army, and then he fights a battle. And it's the thing he does well. And he comes back to this later in 1873 when he first meets the Sioux. And he's on the Yellowstone expedition of 1873. He's in just fighting with his commander. He commands the cavalry. Someone else is in charge of the whole expedition. They're escorting a surveying team for a transcontinental railroad. And, Custer, is aggravating his superior. His superior is writing, talking about, Custer's reputation. Custer is living up to his reputation. He's a problem officer. He's selfish. He's creating all kinds of problems. He has Custer arrested. Custer is talking to a friend of his, a former enemy from the Civil War, Southerner, typical Custer. That's his best friend. Talking about maybe he's going to arrest his own commander for drunkenness, which would be mutiny. And just when it looks like this relationship is going to explode, Custer fights his first battle against the Sioux. Now, he doesn't crush them, but he adroitly reads an ambush and avoids it. He keeps his isolated men under control. He's not reckless. He's not careless. He actually performs very well. He fights another battle a few days later, fights very well. And this commander who's utterly fed up with him, Colonel Stanley, says, it talks about how Custer did so well, and his tone completely changes. And so, this is Custer constantly creating messes for himself through his inability to deal with the world that he had helped to make as an Army officer, especially in the Civil War. And so I follow him in the other areas to follow through this theme, talking about Custer as a writer, talking about the way he tried to, as a popular magazine writer in the new national magazine medium, writing about the Great Plains, trying to explain Indians and trying to explain the natural history of the Great Plains. And, very much using the warped racial science of the day to characterize American Indians. And then turning to his memoirs, and I compare the way he writes and the way the Civil War reinforced his own illusions. His romanticism came out of the war reinforced. As I say, he couldn't have written the incident at Owl Creek Bridge, the Ambrose Bierce story, if somebody had put a gun to his wife Libby's head and told him to write the darkest story he could imagine. It just wasn't in him. The war reinforced his romanticism. So he was popular. He actually had some success as a writer, and yet you see him, how he's kind of at odds with the leading edge of intellectual culture. He tried to go to Wall Street. He spent months, like I said, total of 2 years on Wall Street after the Civil War, added together. And, he's fascinated with cosmopolitan culture, with the attention that's being paid him by the democratic leaders and financiers of New York. But he's trying to launch a silver mine. He doesn't care about actually running the mine. He just wants to float it on Wall Street and make a quick buck. He doesn't understand the corporate world that's coming into being. Later, he not only defends the Northern Pacific in the field, he defends the Northern Pacific Railway in print. But that happens to be the railway that brings down the entire economy in 1873. So the one railroad he speaks up for is just about the worst company in the entire country. This is Custer trying to engage with the modern world, very much, celebrating the new virtues and the new opportunities, and yet personally he can't adapt to it. So long before he gets to the Little Bighorn, this is a man who's in crisis. He's racing to escape becoming obsolete in a world that he had helped to make. And so when he finally rides off to the Little Bighorn, he has alienated President Grant. That's a relationship that runs through the book. He's alienated his patron within the Army, General Sheridan. He's created this enormous mess. And again, as with his other messes, he has one chance to save himself, and that's with a victory in the field. And the irony is that a man who is so capable of creating such disasters for himself, I think in the end, we err by saying that, Custer was this or Custer was that, and that explains his defeat. Rather, I think if we do that, if we run down Custer, he deserves a lot of blame, believe me, I don't exonerate him. I try to find where his personal moral culpability lies. For example, at the Washita, when he attacked a village of sleeping men as well as women and children. I try to find where his more personal culpability and where the larger culpability of the Army and U.S. policy lies. So, I don't excuse him. I try to locate him within the historical context. And yet, out of the desire to distance ourselves from those policies and from those incidents, people often cast Custer as an outlier. It's much more disturbing if we realize he was very much within the mainstream. And I think that we also do a disservice to the astonishing victory at the Little Bighorn by the Lakotas and the Cheyennes, who defeated one of the best combat commanders in the U.S. Army. It was a remarkable achievement that speaks to not only their numbers, but their fighting skill and their leadership and their determination. And I think that, if we describe Custer as an arrogant fool, ironically, we're diminishing the magnitude of that accomplishment. And then at the end of the book, I deal with not trying to retell for the 100th time, an omniscient account of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but I try to show how all the people, who survived, the U.S. Army, the rest of the country, is trying to piece it together at the Reno Court of Inquiry, trying to find out from scattered bits, fragmented bits of testimony what actually happened, and never really quite knowing. And so I try to put the reader in the position of Americans at that time. I present my judgments, which owe a great debt to other historians. But rather than give you a comprehensive view, that's been done many times and done well. I try to give you the experience of Americans at the time, and then finally come back to Libby, who has, late in life, has a reunion with the woman she'd struggled with and been allies with so many years, Eliza Brown. And that's all I'll say about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, TJ. I have a feeling, given that we're talking about Custer, you'll have a lot of questions. So if you raise your hand, we'll get a mic to you. Or you may not.
Beware, if there's no questions, I'll ramble incoherently for a while.
Right in front here.
Oh, yeah, this is very fascinating for me. I grew up in Northern Virginia, so really neither north or south. One of my favorite toys was a Custer toy, and I've always wondered, he was this famous thing, and I love playing with him, but he's a general with a losing record, and I just wondered, how did his PR come about that he became something that you would actually sell to kids and sort of promote as the face of the West? And this was like 70s, I'd say.
Yeah, that's interesting. Would you say that Napoleon had a losing record? Napoleon ended his career with defeat at Waterloo, and yet he had an extraordinary string of victories. He was considered a great genius of warfare, who eventually was overcome. Now, was Custer a genius? I mean, Custer never commanded on the scale of Napoleon. He was not a strategist. He was a tactical commander. And yet, as I said, that was actually the extent of his competence. And by competence, I mean not just flashes of brilliance, but really, professional mastery of fighting. It surprised me. He made some mistakes in certain battles, but often he compensated with, very wise choices and with heroic leadership. The interesting thing about Custer is actually he didn't have a losing record, except for when it really counted at the end. But, it's the question for Custer really isn't why he didn't die at not why did he die at the Little Bighorn, but why didn't he die in 1862 or 3 or 4 or 5? Knowing that the reader is aware of his end, I pull out quotes about him, for example, by his father-in-law, who was very hesitant to let his daughter marry a soldier. And he writes often, my daughter may have a maimed or dead husband. We don't know. Custer is done extraordinarily well, but, who knows what tomorrow will bring. Everybody's afraid he will die. And he spends most of his life from 1861 on, but especially for those 4 years of the Civil War, with everyone convinced that he'll be killed, because that's what happened. Historians now estimate that 750,000 people died in the Civil War. Most not in combat, but still, that's, as a result of the war. Extraordinarily bloody. So, so yes, Custer died at the Little Bighorn in catastrophic fashion, something we legitimately debate. No one has to believe my take on it. And yet, that was, not one of several defeats. It really is, that's why he became so famous, because it was so unexpected, because even people who hated him said, well, yes, he can fight well. And, you follow him in the Civil War, for example, even at the Battle of Gettysburg, where he first made his name. He's put in charge of these troops. They've got this 23-year-old kid put in charge of them. And, people who know the story even a little bit know that he led charges personally, and he said, come on, you Wolverines. And yet, he also did other things during that battle. The cavalry was fighting on the flank of the Union Army against an attempt by Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry to get into the rear of the Army of the Potomac. And, Custer did things like deploy skirmishers on foot so they could make use of their new repeating rifles, talked about how, the Civil War rifles were muzzle loading and they took forever to load, but Custer's cavalry had some of the first repeating rifles where they've got a magazine with 7 bullets and they're going boom, 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 keep shooting. And he wrote about it. This is the most important innovation in warfare. It's not a romantic innovation. It's a technological innovation. He makes good use of it. He's got rifled artillery, which is a relatively new thing, and a very good artillery commander. Makes very wise use of it. So yes, he leads charges, but at very smart moments. He's not just charging blindly, and that characterizes his fighting. In fact, he had conflicts with his division commander before he himself became one, because his division commander was foolhardy and rash, and ordered Custer to send his men into charges when Custer thought it was the wrong idea. Soon after the Battle of Gettysburg, they have a big clash because the Confederates are holding, the rear guard while Lee is trying to escape after Gettysburg. And his commander says, charge. And Custer's men are still coming up. They've only got 100 men. So Custer puts them on foot to cautiously approach because the Confederates are entrenched, like World War I. They've got trenches and fortifications. And he says, no, put them on horseback and charge. So they all get basically wiped out. And Custer's infuriated. Everyone's upset about this. So ironically, actually Custer is one of the more rational and careful commanders. I mean, he's aggressive, but aggressive doesn't mean reckless and rash. It can be, but in his case, it usually didn't. So, so that's why. Americans 150 years ago were not idiots. They promoted Custer and they celebrated him because he was good at what he did. And when he started to do things that were controversial, he became controversial. And we find that, they weren't a bunch of idiots and we know better. That what the British historian E.P. Thompson calls the enormous condescension of posterity. When you look back to the way Americans saw him at the time, he was controversial like he is today, and yet he was celebrated for good reason, as some people celebrate him today. We have to see both sides of him, I think. So what happened in the West, certainly he was, his victory at the Washita, one of the few really big battles, is very controversial and for good reason. And if somebody else has a question, I'll go into details because I'm already going on too long. But, he carried out his orders very capably, and yet it resulted in a lot of non-combatant deaths. And it was very controversial because it was an attack on the camp led by one of the few leaders for peace. And I think that there's understandable reasons why, he didn't single out that guy to attack. He was basically following orders. But the orders themselves were harsh, and Custer saw nothing wrong with them. But he was self-promoting. That's part of why, in the West, he became a symbol of the U.S. in the West. He certainly, affected this image, and he wrote memoirs about his experiences in the West, trying to reinvent himself. So Custer contributed to the propaganda around him. And, specifically in the West, you see him trying to symbolize, he's basically trying to live out, in a way, Dances with Wolves. He liked and admired the abilities of American Indians. They had a lot of native scouts, and you know, he liked them, and he talked to them and he tried to learn from them, even though he did see them as not really human. You know, so he comes from the East. He's trying to show that he can master the West, Just like, Kevin Costner, like, oh, the Indians find him, and oh, what do you know? He's better than any of the Indians at being an Indian. I mean, there's that kind of fantasy that Custer helps to create, really. And, part of it's fantasy, but part of it reflected real ability. So that's a complex answer, but, there's solid reasons, and then there's kind of affectation and propaganda that combine in Custer's story.
TJ, you mentioned the propaganda that he created with his memoirs. Did he also sort of promulgate his own achievements through his journalism as well? Or was that more topic-focused?
No, I mean, a lot of his journalism, I talk about, for example, the essays he did, which were combined into a memoir, which you can buy it in stores, or you can read the originals online through Google Books because it's public domain. It's published, they're collected and published after a couple of years. Most of it is, memoir, a serialized memoir, talking about his experiences in his first few years, culminating in this big attack on the Cheyennes at the Washita. And some of it's actually really entertaining. Some of it's very antebellum and, this long sentences and indirect constructions, and, you're just, it's very hard to read some of it. But the first couple of chapters are, this attempt to be an intellectual. It's people who expected this exciting travelogue had, 2 long essays that are talking about the natural history of the Great Plains and the nature of Native Americans. So, he did both. He was trying to present himself in a certain light, trying to excuse some of his failures. That first year when he's out fighting the Cheyennes, it ends in his court-martial. He's trying to finesse that, definitely, even though sometimes he writes frankly about some of his mistakes. But, this is both, him trying to make himself look better, and it's also, again, that attempt to tell a story about himself, in some ways for himself. In one incident in which shows that actually, they could accomplish the Army's goals without attacking a village of non-combatants, he cornered a village of Cheyennes, and they're trying to get them to move to an Army post. And he had orders to attack, but he was worried that 2 white women who were held as captives would be murdered if he attacked, which they probably would be. So, he ends up negotiating and finally taking hostages. So it's not nice, but it avoids bloodshed. And they release the 2 women, and in his memoir, he writes about it very romantically. Oh, everyone gathered around and wished them well, and they were so relieved, and it was this wonderful moment. But we know from the journals and letters of people who were there, junior soldiers, these are 2 women who've been through hell. And they said one woman who was about 25 looked like she was 50. 50 in 1860. Being 51, I don't want anyone to think that's really old. But, in 1869, that was really old. They're just have gone through deeply traumatic experiences, and you'd never know it from Custer's writing. So, that romanticism both is an attempt to project an image of himself, but it also is his worldview. He's seeing the world and depicting it in a way that Ambrose Bierce, would be screaming his head off about, and probably did, actually.
Thank you. There's a gentleman. There's somebody on the aisle here on our left, and then somebody in the middle there.
Really interesting. Given his background and, I guess, temperament, did he contemplate fighting for the South at all?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I discussed during the election campaign of 1860, he wrote a letter to a friend of his who was a Republican, a childhood friend, and he basically presents the arguments of the secessionists. Now, he still believes in union. He believes that the fire eaters, as they were called, are going to come back into the Democratic Party, that the big split that took place that led to 4 different candidates running for president in 1860, that the Democrats will heal that. But, he says the South has had their rights trampled upon. And, he talks about the equal rights of every state, which at the time meant the right of every state to carry, the South to carry slaves into the Western territories. So, that's very thinly coded code words for being not just pro-slavery, but pro-slavery expansion, which is what the Civil War resulted in the Civil War, the fight over the expansion of slavery. And Custer accepts it. And so at West Point, he made a point of cultivating Southerners. Peer pressure led to the assignment of Southerners in one of the 4 companies of cadets, because for military training, they divided into 4 different companies. And so Custer joined the Southern Company, and that's where his friends were all Southerners. And so during the Civil War, you know, he got reprimanded in writing. And again, because I'm interested in his relations as well as the battlefield, you know, his commander is the same guy who he was mad at for butchering his men, is furious because Custer's doing things like going over his head to communicate with the corps commander, and he's calling truces and going off to see his pals on the other side. It's like fraternizing with the enemy is not allowed. I've told you this before. And so that's Custer. And then, you know, he famously at one battle sees one of his pals from West Point, same guy he meets up with in 1873, sees him on the other side, and he makes this big gesture where he doffs he rides out in front of his men and doffs his hat and a vow and a salute. That's Custer. But, you know, the onset of the war didn't allow for any of that vagary. So, you know, once secession starts, you know, he would have had to have taken a real major act of rejection of the states he called home, of the communities he called home, and of the Union itself. And his father, for example, you know, this Marylander who was very democratic, hated Lincoln, he said, you know, in one letter, if the war becomes a war for abolition, I think all the soldiers should throw down their guns and go home. So, you know, that's where Custer's from. Yet even his father was a Unionist. You know, they weren't copperheads or, you know, Northerners who favored the South, Southern independence, but they were extremely conservative. And Custer was somebody who, in the midst of battle, wanted to win. Winning was extremely important to him. So there was never any doubt about which side he would fight on. But as soon as the war is over, he begins to sympathize politically with the South. And, you know, when I get to his deployment in Kentucky during Reconstruction, that's very interesting because his men are being deployed against the Ku Klux Klan, and Custer does not approve. And the Klan violence in Kentucky was terrible. And that was a real interesting discovery in my book.
Off to our right, dead center.
If Custer had not died at the Little Bighorn, do you think he would have been satisfied to preserve the past, or would he have eagerly engaged the future direction of America?
That's a very interesting question. I think Custer clearly had plans for the future. He was looking ahead to the lecture circuit, for example, but you know, he was handicapped at the moment of his death with something that his wife didn't know about. She discovered. He had been going to Wall Street, and after the failure of his attempt to float the silver mine, he went to Wall Street whenever he was in New York, set up an account with a broker on Wall Street, and began to engage in trading. Now, he just didn't know enough about, the stock market was much smaller then, but he didn't know enough about the economy to really be doing that. And he was not just trading, he was short selling. So, you know, short selling, unless you're, you know, have a major reason for hedging, you know, you're a major financial player and you need to hedge your bets. You know, short selling was a speculative technique. He's counting on the stock price falling. And, you know, he made some money initially, and boom, you know, the gambling addiction sets in. You know, he gets that reinforced. If only he had lost, maybe he would have walked away, but no. He made some money in his first few bets. He was a celebrity, so the stockbroker allows him to trade with no margin. You know, it wasn't, you know, later on a judge rules that that's illegal. Well, it was, you know, it happened a lot on Wall Street. So Custer, you know, engages in more and more trades. Pretty soon he's made close to $400,000 in trades, and he's lost over $8,000. He has to write out an IOU dated due 6 months later at 7% interest, which is pretty hefty. But he writes out the IOU to himself and then endorses it over to this guy. Why did he write it to himself? I think that he didn't want Libby to know what he was up to, because she was so mad at him, like in that passage I read about. That was partially about his gambling as well as his interest in other women, you know, when they would fight. And gambling was a huge problem with him. So I think he was trying to keep his stock market gambling secret. So he went to the Little Bighorn with this massive debt hanging over his head. Just as an example of how much that was, major railroad presidents, the largest corporations in America, $8,000 a year was a typical annual salary for head of a major railroad corporation in the early 1870s. So we're talking about basically some guy with a lieutenant colonel's salary who's owes as much money as the head of GE makes in a year. I mean, it was a big deal. So he had plans to go on the lecture circuit, which actually could have made him a lot of money, but he would have spent a lot of time struggling to overcome this mess he'd created for himself, digging himself out of the hole. And what probably would have happened to him is that he would have found a way to self-destruct over and over again. Would he run for president? Another question I get, because some people have proposed that. I'm familiar with a lot of the Democratic leaders from New York. Tilden was one. He ran for president in 1876. They were the kingmakers of the Democratic Party. They were all in New York, and they all knew Custer. And I've looked at their letters. They were close to Cornelius Vanderbilt, my last subject. No one even mentions Custer. And they knew him personally. So, 1876, they're talking about politics. No one talks about Custer. The idea that he would run for president was ridiculous. His father once said, maybe someday you could be president. But, Libby hated politics. She spent months on Capitol Hill during the Civil War buttering up congressmen to maintain Custer's political support. So his appointment gets confirmed by the Senate, and so that, he has some political backing. And she knew Congress. And she told him, you may not run. He wanted to run for Congress in 1866. She said, no. Politics is for professionals. You are going nowhere near that cesspool. And she kept pushing him away from politics. And so the idea that he would run for president, with Libby, so completely opposing it, he probably would have stayed in the army and then found new ways to self-destruct.
I am sorry we have to leave it there. I can't wait to read this book. Please join me in thanking T.J. Stiles.